Hey folks, it's Ray at DCRainmaker.com here, and today we've got something pretty interesting. We've got Zwift's own leak of Zwift's own upcoming smart bike and smart trainer. Now, this is something that Zwift has talked about publicly for over a year now, almost a year and a half. Their ambitions to build their own hardware, and we're not just talking like a footpaw, but build their own smart bike and build their own trainers. They posted job listings for it. Their CEO has gone on to CNBC and talked about it from a business standpoint. They've more recently done it as well in a podcast with cycling tips. But this is the first time we've seen actual images of what that hardware is going to look like. And ironically enough, it came from Zwift. Last night, Zwift sent out a survey to a bunch of users asking them what they thought about different price points for this piece of hardware, actually two pieces of hardware, compared to their competitors. So Zwift hired a survey company, and within that, they made a fake little virtual bike shop store, and they showed all their competitors at their retail prices, and then they showed these two new hardware pieces from Zwift at various price points. Now, within this survey, Zwift showed two different products. Now, it's possible they have other products beyond that, and it's possible the specs might change by the time they release, and we'll talk about those release dates in just a second. But everyone in the survey received the same two products. The only thing that seemed to differ was the price points. And now looking at these designs, you can see these are very real products. In one case, it looks like actual photographs of the products. Now, I don't have any doubts that these are real images. First off, they came from a Zwift sanctioned company. Second, they went to Zwift users. And third, they matched what we know about what Zwift's been planning for a while. And then fourth, also, some people confirmed it to me that have connections to the team working on this. So it's pretty clear at this point that these things are real. Now, there are two products here. The first one is called the Zwift Wheel. Now, this looks a little confusing at first. What you're looking at, though, is actually a direct drive trainer. So if you look in the middle there, there's that silver part. That's a spinny part, very similar to a Tacx Neo Series trainer. That's the flywheel that spins around. You attach your bike to that in a cassette. In this case, there's no cassette shown on this, though you can see the ridge lines where a cassette would go. But the entire wheel it looks like it's more an aesthetic thing than anything else. That's where the rest of the electronics are probably housed. And it's designed, of course, to match the name, the Zwift Wheel. Okay, and a quick note before we go too much further. If you find this interesting and useful, go ahead and whack that like button right now. It really does help out this video and the channel quite a bit. Now, in this little retail shop, as Zwift is saying, it attaches to your own bike, any bike, and then you go ahead and you have full smart trainer control. From a spec standpoint, they note a couple things. One, a 2200 watt max power. That's pretty standard in the industry. Two, a stated accuracy of plus or minus 1%. Also very standard these days for mid to high-end trainers. Three, a wireless game controller for your bike's handlebars for steering, braking, and other game controls. This makes sense and is in line with other smart bikes having button-based steering. Not quite as ideal as left and right steering of a full smart bike, but button-based is there. And then also game controls, something that today there isn't really anything that's sanctioned by Zwift to do controls from your handlebars without having a phone on it. Next, it notes downhill acceleration. That means it'll spin the wheel forward, the rear wheel forward, to simulate going down here faster. You see that in the Tacx Neo series, the Tacx bike, as well as the Kicker bike. It's not something on the base Kicker trainer though, so it's kind of cool to see it here. They mentioned a 25% gradient simulation, meaning it can simulate grades of 25%. Keep in mind, though, that is not talking about something like a Wahoo Kicker Climb or a riser that rises your front of the bike. This is just simulating the gradient behind the scenes. This is also in line, albeit at the top end, of smart trainers today. They then mentioned terrain simulation, the idea here being something very similar to what Tacx does, where if you go over cobblestones in Zwift, you feel the cobblestones, you feel dirt roads. It's pretty cool. It's a little bit gimmicky, sure, but I find it adds a nice bit of realism. This is interesting because I would have thought that Tacx had this patented, but maybe they don't, or maybe Zwift is licensing it from them, or maybe something else entirely different. Who knows? But then we get to probably the most interesting bit here, actually two interesting bits. Something called ZCog. And this is something where they say it's a so-called single cog design that then allows you to go ahead and mount any bike to it and do virtual shifting. Now, if you think about normal smart bike configurations, something like the Kicker bike, the Tacx bike, the Stages bike, all those bikes, they all have what's called virtual shifting, where basically you're not actually changing anything mechanically in the back. When you press those buttons, it changes software algorithms that simulate different gearing setups. And that all makes sense in a smart bike configuration because you don't actually have real shifters and real drivetrains and anything like that. But if you're allowed to, given this is a smart trainer, place your own bike onto it, you're going to have that rear derailleur in the back of your bike, and it's going to be expecting to go on a cassette. So how they handle this is something I'm definitely looking forward to seeing more details about. The next thing that was really fascinating, which is if I go to a darker image shown or shot at night, you can see that there's this orange ring around the outside, as well as an illuminated like pad down at the bottom that are below the bottom bracket. That illumination below the bottom bracket where that would be is again identical to what the Tacx Neo series would do, but the orange ring there is interesting. I assume that's an LED light that can be any color, and Zwift talks about that later on in a Smartbike having full illumination, but it's kind of interesting to see here, and we'll talk about that to get more on the Smartbike side of it. And that's where we get to the last item on the Smart Trainer, which is that it's upgradable to the Smartbike. So normally, like if you buy a Kicker, Wahoo Kicker trainer, you can't upgrade that to the bike because they're two totally different pieces of hardware. They're not even like, there's just no similarity between them. They're both different, technologies and different everything. And it's, obviously you just can't just like grow that into a Smartbike. But here you can. So now if we look at the Smartbike, and the Smartbike is called a Zwift Ride, what you see there is that same wheel behind the scenes, but now with just a bike frame atop it. And so what Zwift has done here is they've basically taken all the same wheel, it's the exact same trainer because that's the base of your Smartbike. And then they add in full handlebar controls, which they say include steering, braking, and game controls. So similar before, but now built into the handlebars themselves. They've added immersive lighting, which they say will, quote, take the fun and performance of your training to the next level with lighting that brings Zwift world into your home. Now what that means could be, who knows? But there's a couple thoughts here. One, in the case of Tacx, they use that lighting to signify intensity. So the higher your intensity, the darker the reds get. In the case of Zwift, though, there's a lot of things they could do with this. For example, as you unlock different things in a game, as you go across, for example, sprint line, that kind of stuff, you could go ahead and have those lights change to different colors. Same goes for ending of an interval, which might get to their kind of performance bit they talked about there. Lots of possibilities, though. And then the next thing, though, is also super interesting, which is that this entire bike is able to rotate vertically to go ahead and reduce storage space. So if you are in a tight apartment, you can now reduce this whole thing straight up and then gain a little bit of storage space in front of it. Just something we have not seen in any of the smart bikes today, but is actually pretty common in a number of treadmills. After that, we've got multiple crank links. In fact, you can see that if you look closely at that crankset there, it's got that bear claw design, meaning that you put your pedal spindle in different spots, exactly like the Stages bike and the Wild Kicker bike, and now also the Tacx Neo series bike, where basically you can get like a 170, 172.5, 175 crank length just by putting it in different holes. So that makes sense there, which gets to the fact that they said it's designed for riders from 5 feet to 6'6", so 152 centimeters to 198 centimeters with, quote, multiple adjustment points. And then finally on the front, you've got this also illuminated wheel there that literally looks like a real-world Tron bike. Zwift has made a real-world Tron bike version of their popular virtual Tron bike that you can lock in the game itself, which you gotta like step back and go, someone sat at a table and said, you know what we should do? Let's make that thing real. And they did it, and it's cool. I think like visually, this is definitely, it's making a statement here. But there are still lots of questions, both technically and non-technically. So starting off with a couple of technical questions. One, will it support ANT Plus and Bluetooth Smart standards? So ANT Plus FEC, Bluetooth Smart FTMS, meaning could you use this on Zwift, but then also turn around and use it on Trainer Road? I would hope that would be the case. After all, Zwift is 100% dependent on utilizing those industry standards today. So for them to turn around and ignore it in their own product would be a pretty big slap in the face to not just consumers, but the industry and everyone else. So hopefully that's the case there. It doesn't say anything in the specs one way or the other, so we don't know. We, of course, also don't know how this will actually perform real life accuracy-wise. Every company states claims, and then, of course, if you watched my reviews, you know I tear apart those claims and show how things actually work. So we don't know that either. And we don't have a ton of details on the adjustability aspects and what that all means. Still, this is interesting. The other thing we don't see here, though, that's clearly probably not going to be part of this is one, any sort of front screen. So like a Peloton bike, a front screen there, nor do we see any sort of climb or riser functionality built into it. And this is notable because in Zwift's job descriptions, they talked about hydraulics, and clearly that is not here at all. And then on their CEO calls over the past couple of years, they've talked about really wanting to mirror that Peloton all-in-one experience where everything just works out of the box. So while that doesn't appeal to everyone, it does appeal to a pretty big portion of the base that doesn't want to tinker with having to still set up a second display and get connectivity working and all that kind of stuff. So my guess here, though, is that they've looked at the current manufacturing climate, logistics, supply chain, chipsets, and all that kind of stuff and said, We just need to, for our first gen product, get this out the door and not try to boil the ocean. And given what I've heard about Zwift's challenges with their manufacturing partners, that probably makes a lot of sense. So that gets some of the last questions is what about pricing and what about availability? So now the purpose of this survey was very clearly pricing, and people have received a wide variety of different pricing options, though most of them tend to be pretty similar to the Wahoo Kicker and on trainer side, so about $1,200 US, and they tend to float between $2,200 and $2,700 on the Smartbike side, which undercuts almost everybody in the industry from a Smartbike standpoint. For example, the Wahoo Kicker bike is at $3,500, the Tacx Neo bike is at $3,200, the Stages bike I believe is at $2,799 right now, and so on down the list. And of course, each of those bikes has pros and cons compared to the Zwift bike, so this is definitely not a industry killer by any means, unless the price is low enough to be that way. So at $2,200, it's going to basically wipe out most of those top-end smart bikes because people probably aren't going to pay an extra $1,000 or $1,300 for the functionality in a Kicker bike to go up and down, where they may pay that for, Philips Hue style neon lighting around your wheels. Hey, whatever works. Anyways, we'll find out that down the road. The next question is how far down the road? And that thing is actually a little bit easier because some people confirmed it to me, which is basically next July. So Zwift is looking to go ahead and launch this next July 2022, or this July, depending on when you watch this video. And that makes sense for a number of reasons. Number one, Eurobike this year is in July, mid-July. Two, there is La Course, which is the Women's Tour de France. And the official name of that is the Tour de France Femme avec Zwift, which is the Tour de France Women's with Zwift in French. And so in that case, they're the headline sponsor for that event. And it makes sense to launch it either with that or slightly ahead of that, probably Eurobike a week prior. And of course, then you also have the Tour de France going on in July as well. But if I was Zwift, I would save that for Eurobike and La Course because it makes sense from a sponsorship standpoint. And that's again what people have confirmed. Apparently they built about 100 or so test units at this point, but we don't really know where that stands in the grand scheme of readiness. Just for kind of comparison and things like that, 100 test units of something like the Wahoo Kicker bike or the Tacx Neo bike would have been built about a year out or so. So we don't really know how on target they are for that July timeframe. I would suspect they will probably still announce it in July, but the actual availability may vary quite a bit after that point. So we can look to something like Wahoo, where they announced initially for just very limited countries, I think just the US for the first X number of months, many months, and then eventually went into Europe in just a few markets, the UK, I believe, and then from there into continental Europe, and then slowly region by region over the course of what I think has been a year and a half beyond that. And I suspect the same thing is true here, especially given the logistics climate of today, the world of 2021, now 2022. That's not going to change very much in the next few months. Okay, so there you go. Just a really quick first look at things. It's definitely interesting. I'm curious to see where this goes. I think overall, looking at this design, my thoughts is that they've kind of had to make some compromises. They've had to have a bit of a reality check with their ambitions and put it back into the making something that competes pretty much head to head with their competitors' hardware. I don't think there's any competitor killers here. Again, depending on the price point. If the price point drops low enough, if they use some of that $500 million they raised to go ahead and fund the hardware at a lower price point, then yes, that could definitely wipe out most of their higher end competitors. And the same is true on the smart trainer side. At $1,200, it's honestly kind of a wash based on the specs they show there compared to all their other competitors. Still, time will undoubtedly tell, so definitely stay tuned to this channel for more sports technology goodness. And again, if you found this video interesting and useful, go ahead and whack that like button or hit subscribe because January is going to be crazy pants. With that, have a good one.